Welcome, everyone. Today is Wednesday, March 27th. We are at the CNAB public community meeting, and we are recording, so just an FYI, anything you say will be online forever. Okay, if you're new, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We always love new people joining the community, and we want to know who you are and what you're working on and all of that. So feel free to throw in something in the Zoom chat. Okay, do we have any demos today? I will take silence as no, and there are none on the agenda listed, so we can move on to the next item. Let's talk about the duffle image relocation requirements. Glenn, do you want to take it away there?
Yeah, so I raise this because I've started looking at the implementation of this issue 668, duffle relocate, and the approach I'm taking is one that we've been using in Pivotal for a while, which is involves mapping repositories in a particular way, and it doesn't involve moving the CNAB around from registry to registry. It's really operating on a local CNAB and producing another local CNAB. So it's just relocating the images and then updating the image map. That's the intention. And I was a little bit concerned because there was a lot of chatter in the Slack room about CNAB to OCI being used in duffle. And I thought maybe the intention was to make CNAB to OCI the kind of the only way that duffle manipulated images. And looking at some of the PRs that come along recently, it seems like CNAB to OCI doesn't do quite what I want in this issue. So I wanted to just hash this out, and see whether I was kind of going in a conflicting direction or whether we could actually implement both or what. As Radu pointed out earlier, the push-pull kind of PR might be a separate requirement and use case from the image relocation. I hadn't got my mind around that. To me, it seemed very similar. I think a naive user might think that pulling an image and then pushing it, pulling a bundle and pushing it should be a kind of superset of relocating a bundle in terms of the type of mapping that's done on the images. It might be a bit of a surprise factor if they were kind of different in their semantics.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Would you mind walking us through what you had in mind for the image relocation bits?
Yeah, what we do at the moment is we take an image prefix, what we call an image prefix. So it'd be something like gcr.io/myuser. If we're putting it on a GCR registry, for example, take that prefix, and then we modify all the image names that we are working with to have that prefix. But we don't map them all to the same repository with different digests, because we want the result to be kind of readable by a human being. Because we're going to edit some Kubernetes configuration files and put the new image names in there. And people can kind of get hold of those and see them. And if they're all referring to the same repository with different digests, that makes it really hard work for the human being reading the configuration file. So what we do is we preserve the user portion in the later part of the path with some dashes in between. In fact, we've got a fairly complicated algorithm. We do some preservation of the path, and we also add a little hash on the end to avoid collisions. It's possible to have collisions if you've got two repositories which differ only in their host name, for example. So that seemed to work quite nicely, and I don't know whether that would be a feasible policy to adopt in CNAB to OCI, for example, because it seems to have some advantages. It's got the same authentication properties as CNAB to OCI because you end up with the same username, essentially.
Yeah, and I think I'm not sure if Sylvain is around to walk us through how a simple bundle would, how pushing and pulling a bundle end up in the registry as compared to what Glenn just described. But essentially, what the PR that Glenn referenced right now in duffle, there's 668 or 681, I think, that I opened up earlier today, which plain uses just the CNAB to OCI library to just do a simple push and pull, which essentially reads the bundle JSON file. It pushes all of the images to a single registry under the same repo, under different hashes. And then there's a fix-up part at the end, which just reads the SHA from the registry and updates the bundle, and then uploads the bundle as an OCI index to that registry. So this is in the most simple push and pull scenario, and I'm trying to figure out if, first of all, if there's any sense in having different things happening for a relocation versus a simple bundle push. And if it doesn't make sense to have different things happening, then which route should we take into going forward? Because yeah, I do agree that having different things happening for a push versus a relocation might be confusing. At the same time, if it makes sense to have different things happening, then they are different use cases though. So I'm thinking that for a user who just wants to have their bundle pushed somewhere and don't care what happens with the images because they're going to be authorized to pull them later from, it doesn't matter where they're going to pull them from, they just want to have the bundle downloadable from somewhere else, they don't have to think about image relocation at all. So in this case,
I guess the big question is, in that push-pull use case, would it be a problem for the user to see all their images relocated to the same repository?
I'm not necessarily certain that I'm the right person to answer that. I'll defer it also to Sylvain or probably Simon, who implemented the CNAB to OCI bits, and to someone else more familiar with the registry discussion from our side.
The main idea with the fix-up thing is that if you can pull the bundle, then you also can pull all the images, just to make sure that you can do that. That's the main reason.
So that's like an authentication level issue, is it?
Excuse me?
Is it just authentication that you're talking about from that point of view?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I think the other solution kind of deals with that, because we map to repositories with the same username. So if a user is authenticated to one of them, he or she will be authenticated to all of them.
Right, and so there is an additional concern I also had regarding to duplicating images. So, assuming there are multiple CNAB bundles, and those bundles then are using same images, then we end up duplicating those images also in the registry, right? And so that is an additional overhead also. If
the mix-up is not if the image is already in the registry, just mounting the image.
Yeah.
So the main question that I have at this point is there any issue in right now us going forward with these two approaches and then continue to discuss? So I don't want to block any of these two items of work going for at least during this week, because both of them are valid and we should have support for both of them in duffle. Is everyone okay with us continuing the work on both push and rewrite this week, and then reconvening next week and comparing notes to see if things can converge into a single model?
Hey guys, it's Steve. I missed some of the conversation. I was trying to follow the issue is that you're trying to move the images from one registry to another as you're doing somebody just wants to move their CNAB from a public place to their one. Is that what the root of the conversation is?
That's the image relocation use case, yeah.
And keep in mind that the image relocation scenario doesn't deal with pushing the bundle itself in the registry. Is that correct, Glenn?
Yeah.
So if I'm trying to push something from one registry to another, don't I want everything together? And I guess I would kind of assume that I'd be able to specify where I want to push, not just the registry, but what repo that I'd want it in. So I'm trying to understand. Then the image names and the tags should follow. And if those image names and tags are still there, or reference the same ones, because I might have several bundles that reference the same WordPress chart. If one's a newer version, then that gets pushed and the layer resolution gets resolved as well. So I'm kind of confused on what maybe I just missed part of the setup on this.
I think both are valid use cases. I think Redu already mentioned that. So Glenn, I don't think the OCI, CNAB to OCI pull requests for push and pull like block what you're doing, and I don't think that your use case is invalid. I mean, that makes perfect. Their relocation scenario makes perfect sense, and I think that we can these PRs are so that we can get a push and pull model just like set in. But I do see room for us to talk about maybe changing the push and pull implementation to allow images to be pushed to their own repositories and like the next iterations. Perhaps that's a conversation that we can talk about, and then that would match your model of how relocation works.
Yeah, I just thought it was worth having the discussion at this point rather than having a kind of collision down the road and confusion for the users.
Yeah, and it definitely, I think, yes, I agree, and I'm glad we had this conversation because now we understand clearly the differences between the two approaches, and that we should revisit this once we've gotten the implementation.
Yeah. And there may be use cases where the
that's the part that I was trying to understand.
repository is actually better.
Oh, sorry. I think both Steve and Glenn were talking at the same time.
Go ahead,
so
Steve.
I'm going to finish, and then Steve can continue.
Okay. I was going to say there may be use cases where the mapping to a single repository is actually better. One of my colleagues has pointed out for ECR, that's actually more usable. So it might be best to have it as an option. So we can sort that out further down. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Well, I'm just trying to understand, because different registries did implement the pathing differently. GCR uses the first root of the path to be the entity, the org, the person. ACR and ECR use domain names. So, but I think ECR is only one root deep, kind of like Docker Hub. So you get like the org and that's it. Where with ACR, we kind of watch what the others are doing, and there is no limit to the pathing that you could do nested. So in some of them, you're going to have collisions because the root is a different org, and some of them you could only go so deep. So I think it's what I was just trying to understand more of what it was that we were trying to do is that we were just trying to move one thing to another, and you don't care what the image names are, so completely uniquify them so there's no collision, or was it you do want to try to reconcile what the image names are, so when they get deployed, like in Kubernetes, you can actually read the image name and understand what it is.
Yeah, we're trying to have our cake and eat it. So we put a short hash in the mapped image name to get some level of uniqueness. Obviously, it's not mathematically guaranteed to be unique, but it tends to be unique. And then also preserve meaningful parts of the path so the users can see what happened.
Yeah, so it's recognizable when they're looking at it as deployed in whatever container host they're looking at.
Yeah, and particularly when the users are us trying to debug a problem, it's quite handy to see what happened.
Yeah. So that's like I said, I'm just trying to understand what you guys were shooting for here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So it is trying to just uniquely get it across, no conflicts, just make it work, make it happen. Don't the clarity of the images. You're trying to have, like you said, your cake and eat it too.
Yeah, that's right.
One of the things that we are trying to do, and this is actually an interesting use case, one of the things we're having in the OCI conversation is how do we standardize what's been referred to as the catalog API. Right now, all the clouds have varied implementations. If there was a standard as part of the copy semantics, the move semantics, you could actually query the registry with a well-known API and says, hey, does this thing exist? And you could kind of do the typical, yes, it exists, and I want to override it. Yes, it exists, I want to reference it, or there's the -1, -2, -3, whatever the semantics are. So that was, that, I guess the question is, what is the desired outcome that you guys are looking for?
Yeah, I think we'd better take that offline, actually, because I need to go into some detail to understand what you're talking about, really.
Okay, we can talk offline. I don't want to dominate the whole conversation.
Yeah, okay.
I am just interested in the, how the registry stuff plays through, so I'm happy to help anywhere there.
Yeah. What's your time zone?
Pacific.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So just to sum this up, Glenn, the more I think about it, the more it feels like the use case you're describing could be a flag for push as well. So that whenever users are trying to push a bundle, they could have the option to relocate the images in the way that you're describing. So I think it makes sense for us to go forward working both PRs for the next couple of days, and then reconvene and try to give the options the user to merge the two approaches. Does that make sense? Is that okay for everyone?
The principle's fine by me. Next couple of days, it probably won't be realistic because I've got some other work to do. But yeah, in general, that's fine.
All right. Great. So the next bullet on the agenda is image relocation versus storing bundles and registries. Well, we just talked about that. So does anybody have anything else that they wanted to add? Okay, great. Okay, and then the last item on the agenda is the Go client for CNAB to avoid circular dependencies, simple vendoring for projects trying to use code from duffle. Reddy, was that you or who put that on?
Yeah, that was also me. So last night, Michelle, Sylvain, and I paired for I was going to say a couple of hours, which is realistic, on trying to get CNAB to OCI to work back in duffle for push and pull support. And essentially what we realized, among many dependency issues with containerd, Docker distribution, and others, was that CNAB to OCI took a dependency on the duffle bundle package. And essentially there's a circular dependency in which CNAB to OCI requires duffle requires CNAB to OCI, and then you have the circle dependency. So what I did earlier today was I created a Go CNAB repo where I just took the package parts of duffle and put them in there, and then I forked CNAB to OCI and essentially used the new tool and not reference duffle directly. So this is something that we've been discussing for the last couple of weeks, which is having a separate Go client for CNAB in Go that we can reference from duffle and from other tools. And the main question is, the main reason why we decided to wait for a couple of more weeks there was to have some stability on the duffle packages before taking them out. So at this point, the main question is, do we feel that we achieved that? And what packages do we think make sense to have out of duffle and into a separate client? Is bundle, is it also the claims, is it something else? And what do people think about this?
I have some thoughts on that. I don't know if anyone else did, but so I'm working on this with Porter because Porter is basically trying to sit on top of duffle and reuse all of it and pretend it's Porter's, steal all of its thunder. There's a ton of really useful logic actually in the main package, all the commands. And in the, like, not really the commands, not the Cobra commands, but there's a bunch of files up in the CMD package that are incredibly useful that I'd like to move into this new thing and then have them maybe stop using not global, but global state. Like they rely on things like global environment variables to know where they should be storing files, like duffle home. If they could be like, you could make an instance of duffle and then be able to tell it this is where you should be storing things, and then have all those functions off of that, like some sort of struct instead, so that we can make an instance of duffle and then be able to say, hey, this is where you should be storing everything, and then be able to set it to Porter's home that would be incredibly useful, because we're doing things like basically replicating a lot of the functions and being able to say, we want to be able to use all of the credential commands and the claim store and all that other type of stuff, and be able to basically do everything duffle does, but not going through the CLI.
I think that's a separate concern. I think that's for only duffle vendoring. Use duffle as a library, as we do in Docker app. But for other projects using just the CNAB types, like a bundle or actions or credentials, I think that's two use cases. Two separate use cases. One is to use duffle as a
Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
While there are separate use cases, Caroline had a really good point in which there is a lot of code in the CMD package in duffle, which does things that should not be in the CMD but should be in the package in other packages. One example is finding bundles by reference or by file on the file system. We have at least, I think, 3 or 4 functions in the main package in duffle, which loads bundles, deals with references versus files, checks if it's a file or a reference, and then goes on the file system and looks for it. I think yes, while there are separate use cases and there should be a client versus an SDK discussion, we should first refactor some of that out of the main packages into package. So the main question is do we feel comfortable having a client which only has the types of duffle, meaning the types defining the CNAB spec, the bundle, actions, claims, credentials, which essentially are right now in duffle package, and each of those has a top level directory, together with a separate SDK which searches bundles on the file system, creates, validates parameters, and does stuff like that. Do we feel okay having a client and an SDK repo to do that, or doesn't really make sense and we can have them in a single repo?
Wait, I guess the terms don't make a lot of sense to me. So can you explain? Are you saying one is just for reusable types? I don't know which one's which. And then the other one is for all the logic that makes up duffle?
I think this is what Sylvain was suggesting. The question is, do we need to have them as separate repos, or can we have them as a single repo with separate Go packages? Is there any harm in doing that? Which is the most simple thing to do, honestly.
I think having them all together is fine. Whatever breaks that cyclical dependency for you, though, is what's important.
Yeah, that will do it for us. I experimented today with getting all the packages out, and it did the trick just fine.
Yeah. I mean, but the other part of what was really hard to vendor duffle, and let me know if we should talk about this later, was one, we're using code in Docker that isn't released, so we're pinned to specific revisions, which is ridiculously difficult. And then two, I submitted this PR to, or I submitted an issue, and I think maybe it just got fixed. One of our dependencies was one of the Docker Compose repositories. Didn't have a proper dep manifest. So anybody who depended on it wasn't actually getting the constraints properly. So you had to replicate it with overrides. So that was like, there's a whole bunch of different things that make it very hard to use because the constraints aren't being propagated through the tree right too. So like, is there anything we can do to help push our dependencies, either cut real releases or to just make sure that the dependencies can be communicated through the graph? Because that would help a lot, just anyone who's relying on this. Because right now it's a bunch of like iterative work with dep ensure and adding overrides and trying to understand why are there pinned revisions and do I really need them or are they old? Like I had to probably spend like an hour doing that and I wrote dep, so that's not good.
I don't think that's something we can fix, mainly because we're using different revisions for example, for Docker distribution and for containerd, and even for Golang XSys, for example, we need to pin a revision. So, and things that are out of our release cycle. So I don't think that's going to be fixed through us separating duffle into separate packages.
Do you know when those are, like, do we have people from Docker who know when those are going to be released? Because I've seen releases come since. Those were pinned in like January. Do you know what this, like the release cycle timing is on those that we can go, we expect in May that they'll finally get merged or?
I don't have any visibility on that. Sylvain might be able to help us there, but I'm not sure if it's going to be that straightforward, mainly because there are so many things that at this point, if you look at the dep files of all of the things involved, there are a lot of things. I'm not going to say too many things, but there are a lot of things which are pinned down with overrides because of that.
I'm curious, why are there dependencies on that deep on Docker and Docker Compose and things?
Well, so we rely on the Docker CLI, and that trickles down to that. It's not Docker Compose. I'm sorry. It picks up like various Docker Kubernetes Docker Compose related things that are just necessary to get everything to build.
We build invocation images and we run actions inside containers. So essentially, we're using the Docker CLI to start containers, to build images, which in turn have dependencies on containerd, on Docker distribution, and on other packages inside CLI, even though we're not using them directly. Does that answer your question, Steve?
Vaguely. I thought the idea was to abstract all that out so we weren't dependent on the Docker client or even many of these Docker libraries that we were trying to do containerd. And so
yeah, we are, but at this point, the simplest thing to run invocation images is to use the CLI. We have an open item to move to containerd, but we're still going to have a dependency on containerd and on Docker distribution and on other things. For example, to normalize invocation images, we still have we would still have some dependencies on other packages, which are not in our release cycle. So,
right. So, if I may, so just to be clear, there's things that are point in time related, like just what we can use now and what we haven't finished and so forth, things like that, right? And then there's things like if we do all the replatting and sort of abstracting away, there are things we're left with that we have to use anyway. Do we have a clear list of what those are? Or is that what the last bit that you were trying to say?
I don't think we have a list of the things we would end up having to use anyway, but I think we can make a list of that offline.
Yeah, I mean, no need to belabor it here. I'm just curious because I do think that we want to try and move toward abstracting as much as we can for two reasons. One is for flexibility and design, and the other one is obviously for sheer practical compilation problems and so forth. But whatever, I'm sure we'll get there.
The main reason why we decided to use the Docker CLI for this is because it abstracts a lot of things and it allows us to run a container with a minimal amount of code involved.
Yeah. No, this is why we use it. Absolutely. But I'm like we're going forward as we iterate.
Okay, Ruddy, do you feel like you got a resolution? Because I didn't really get a feel for a clear resolution on like what you were asking on like what you want to actually take out. So I think you were asking what are the common packages that we want to like separate into like an SDK sort of situation.
Yeah, and from at least from the Porter use case, it feels like we still we still have a lot of things to pull out of the main packages in Duffle, but it feels like whatever is right now in GitHub.com Duffle package should be part of that Go client in the end.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, especially I think the image builder thing the image builder package will really help people. Claims I was unsure on because I'm not really sure if other clients also use the claim store. Like, is that what Porter does, Carolyn, or do you expect Porter to support claim storage in the future?
It will, yeah.
Okay, great.
And
okay,
it is part of the CNAB spec. So
oh, right, yeah.
interested clients might want to use it, even though even if they're not using the claims stored directly on the file system, they might want to read and write claims somewhere else.
Okay. So, Carolyn, does your issue, I know you submitted an issue, but I didn't get around to reading it thoroughly. So I think your issue mentioned that you wanted to take some of that logic that's in CMD and take it out and put it into the PKG world. So I think that's like the first step, right? And then you want to do the transfer redo. Do you want to wait on that? Because if you do the transition, then then Carolyn would have to make the changes to your new repo.
Yeah, I like for multiple people to pair on pulling things out of the main package into the client, mainly to understand what they're using. But yeah, that would be the first step. I already have a repo that contains the duffle packages into a separate one, and we can iterate on that surely.
Okay, you and I can pair on that later if you want. Okay, and Carolyn will loop you in as well.
Yeah, there isn't really a rush because no one's mad at me for copying and pasting the duffle code. So, just let me know what I can help with.
Okay.
The main urgency came up with us trying to use CNAB to OCI, which takes a dependency on duffle.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I don't have any other agenda items, so at this point I'll open the floor up for anything that people want to ask about or discuss.
Yeah, Ryan and I have this proposal out for, it's kind of evolved a little bit because we've split it up into two separate issues. So the first issue that we've been trying to focus on is actually having the specification adopt JSON schema fully. What we noticed in kind of actually trying to make a PR to have objects and arrays is that it's close to JSON schema, but very subtly different. And it's actually really confusing for that reason. And we think we can achieve what the specification has today just by adopting JSON schema fully, as well as getting the objects and arrays that we're hoping for. So kind of wanted to open that up if we want to discuss that now, or if we could continue the conversation in the issue that we created in the CNAB spec. That would be great, just because the conversation has stalled a bit there as well. So
this is the this is PR 145, correct? Add schema field to parameter section.
Yes, I think that's correct. I think it's 145. Yep, that's the one.
Okay. Yeah, does anybody have anything right now? Have people gotten a chance to take a look at this pull request? Also, I have. So I was looking at it, and to me, this makes sense. But what I'm doing right now is trying to figure out what things in Duffle this affects and what the implementation would look like. So I don't think this affects import-export, but Butcher asked me specifically to look at import-export for this, so I don't know if I'm missing something. but I'm going to look into that a little bit more. So that's on my agenda for today, and how install would work using schemas and schema validation as well. Off the bat, I mean, this makes sense to me.
This also affects any downstream tooling. So I'm thinking about the VS Code extension and the visual installer, but there are all at the same time, there are a bunch of other things that are breaking right now. There are breaking changes that have to be updated there. So I don't think Ivan would hate us that much if we give him another breaking change.
So schema support is optional, or schema, yeah, the schema field is optional. So does that mean that clients have to like implement this? Like, would the VS Code extension have to like implement schema support? I guess that's something I should also ask Ivan.
And it's also a question for the people who started this PR. So if a client doesn't need to doesn't want to validate the schema, can it? It's not a breaking change; it's just an additive one, right?
I still think it's a breaking change in the sense that we would like. I guess it's a little bit confusing because in this PR we're adding a field called schema, but what we're saying is like actually just fully adopt like the keywords that are in full JSON schema. And I think that clients would have to support that. It is an optional field, so I don't know. I feel like if you wanted a client to fully support the JSON schema, then yes.
So if I may, just to clarify what I'm understanding, we're adding a schema field for JSON schema. If a client wanted to support JSON schema, they would have to understand this. And then the question is, that would enforce all clients, that would insist that all clients who wished to support this would have to do validation in advance, or would the invocation image do that?
Ryan, do you want to go for it? I feel like.
I mean, I think the intention of having a schema statically written into the bundle JSON was so that a runtime could actually do the validation ahead of invocation.
Right. So the functional activity here, I'm just being clear, forgive me. So the functional activity here is that if a runtime wishes to support the JSON schema approach, the runtime would have to validate or risk blowing up in some way in the invocation image if the invocation image didn't blow up. Does that seem correct?
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Okay.
I think that go ahead. I think the bigger question here is like our concern about adding the schema subfield into the specification, even though it's optional, is that it really kind of muddies the water about what the actual validations are for parameters. So like schema validation for the JSON schema subsection has things like min items and max items and additional properties and a whole bunch of like JSON schema specific validations. And the parameter section also has this, but it's a subset and it's implemented slightly differently. So it's like a JSON schema lookalike that I think from like a usability perspective creates confusion.
Sure. So if there are three different JSON languages for different things that are inputs in the manifest, then that creates an implementation problem. It also creates a usability problem. So that makes sense completely to me. Then the problem here becomes one of completeness, in the sense that if we have JSON schema and it is consistent and complete, that makes sense from a usability implementation problem. And the problem becomes that puts everything back on the runtimes. The clients all have to figure out whether they're going to support that or validate it. as opposed to invocation images. But it's optional. So there will be supporting versions and unsupporting versions. Does that sound right? If it does, then the general thrust of the PR seems correct. In other words, those are good arguments. What does everybody feel about all of the client burden that this implies on changing clients? Or are there significant clients that might be written that do not wish to implement JSON schema validation in a runtime and instead defer to invocation?
I have some thoughts about it together with a question. So I know I'll start with a question, which is, I know at some point in discussing this PR, there was the question of having a JSON schema for the bundle itself. And I know that during this discussion right now, there have been a bunch of confusion between a schema validation for parameters and for the bundle itself. And I want to have clarity on that first. The second one is, if the schema is optional for parameters, is it a I'm wondering if users of the bundle itself can choose between providing, or bundle authors can choose between providing a schema or the parameter validation that comes in CNAB itself, because both of them don't really make much sense to have both validation there, mainly because the JSON schema is itself a superset of the schema of the parameter validation that we have.
So sorry, remind me, your first question was basically,
It was to have
are we talking about
clarity.
bundle JSON or the parameters?
Yeah, I know that this discussion is for parameters. I'm
Yeah.
wondering what was the status of having a schema, a JSON schema validation for the bundle itself, and if this PR is concerned in any way about that.
Yeah, so actually the current state of this PR isn't doing either yet. And we haven't actually talked about like having the bundle JSON be JSON schema conformant, but I think it would be valuable to do that as well. I personally don't see any problems with doing it that way, but maybe you all could like fill me in there. But I guess like one thing I do want to clarify, because it is confusing to look at this PR and think that that's what we're submitting. This current PR has a subfield for schema, but if it sounds like we all agree that we could have JSON be schema conformant, have the specification be JSON schema conformant and have clients optionally validate that if they wish, we would change this PR then to have the CNAB spec do that. And then maybe additionally in a separate PR have bundle JSON be schema conformant as well.
Are there any downsides that anybody knows to doing JSON schema conformance here in the other fields, for example, the other areas? Like, what's the downside for the conformance itself rather than the validation?
For parameters itself, I don't see any for the bundle, for the whole bundle to have a JSON schema. I wouldn't comment on that yet. I'm not that familiar with the changes involved.
Is 145 the only pull request right now to look at?
Yes, and we actually can make a second PR to maybe be more illustrative of what we're talking about if we were to like conform to JSON. Maybe that'll be an easier way to start talking about this. But it sounds like there's enough people that are interested in it. We just kind of want to know if there's edge cases or problems with it.
Yeah, for me personally, the second PR would be really helpful in being able to compare and contrast what we're talking about here.
That makes sense. I can add like a little summary about what we talked about to this one and then link it to the new PR.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, anything else people want to talk about? Feel free. Last minute demos.
I just wanted to bring up that we have duffle push and pull working in a very rough state, which is duffle can take a bundle and push it to a registry and then take it back and use it. So yay! It only took like 4 hours of mingling with Go dependencies to have it compiled. So
Yeah, awesome. Oh, and I've been moderating and I completely forgot to talk about the stuff that I've been working on this week, so I'll just take some time. Okay, so I've been working on what the digest field actually means. So I've, at first thought, we think about Docker and how OCI images and image registries work. You get a hash of that top level manifest and you compare to see like if that hash matches what you have pulled down, and then you verify that like you have the thing that you're actually pulling down. So that's cool. But when you do a duffle build locally, or when you do a duffle build, you get like the invocation image locally, and you don't have any Docker manifest. That's like a registry specific thing. And so what exactly should go in the digest field, if anything? So I've been thinking about this. I went down a few different paths. First, I was like, well, maybe we'll just build a manifest and store it somewhere locally, and then take a hash of that. But then that doesn't really make sense for the import-export case, which is like a full like tar file. It's just like a tar file, which is your Docker image. So I've also been exploring the route of just taking the hash of the taking a 256 or 512 like SHA checksum of the actual tar file. And so what I would do is build the invocation image and then tar compress that and then take a hash of that and then save it in the digest field. So then if we did it that way, then we wouldn't necessarily have to worry about like the registry manifest component. Anyways, I've been thinking about how to, the overview, high level overview is like, what do you take a hash of to verify the image you're installing is the one you want? And how do you make it so that it's not dependent on a registry component? So I'll write up an issue detailing like what the paths are possibly, and put it in the Slack chat or something. There's a bunch of stuff going on in chat in early 2020. What? I don't know what that means, but I'm in. Sign me up. Everybody else is running for president too.
Anything that gets rid of having to push to a registry in order to have a viable bundle like definition makes me happy.
Okay, cool, awesome. That's actually nice to hear, because I really did think about that a lot yesterday. I was like, should we require a registry component? What are real use cases for? Oh wow, Ralph is gonna have a meltdown.
Anything that says require a registry and a network push and pull to put a stamp on something is bad.
Yeah,
so
and like
great.
The manifest logic is like okay, so like manifests aren't stored anywhere locally. At first I thought, oh, you have this like Docker image and you have a manifest stored somewhere on your like on the like local file system, but that's not the case. The manifest is pulled and parsed, but not stored anywhere on your machine. And that was a big thing that like got me confused yesterday, that I had to like work through and ask around about. So anyway, still thinking through all that stuff right now.
That's the right direction for sure, at least from my position.
Okay, cool. I'll write up an issue. I think it'll be more coherent that way. So anyways, anybody else have anything? Okay, cool. Well, then we get 9 minutes back. Thanks everyone for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your day. See ya.